Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock on December the 15th because among her many talents, my guest today is a supermum, and 5 o'clock doesn't really work for childcare. But let's not give up. Are we giving up all secrets now? Today, I'm using a virtual background of one of my two favorite islands in the world. One is Grand Cayman Islands, and the other is the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. And my guest today is also passionate about the Outer Hebrides and the Isle of Lewis and Harris. So in honor of my guest today, the virtual background of Achmore on the Isle of Lewis, my guest today is my dear friend, Maeve Gillies, who is, have I referred to you before, a creative entrepreneur, a fellow GlobalScot, business person and designer. And we were just talking before we went on air and about the importance of beauty and designer of beautiful things, an appreciator of beautiful things. You're an appreciator, I've just made that up. Anyway, enough from me. Over to you, my guest today on What Comes Next Live, Maeve.
Hi, Tom. Well, thanks so much for having me along. I'm delighted to be here today, and I feel like I'm almost in the islands with you. It's interesting. I've been when you first asked me to be on this show, I was at the beginning of lockdown, I was sort of full of this dread of having, would I even have something meaningful to say? What do you say at the beginning of lockdown? So I think, for me, the process has been a lot of listening and learning and really enjoying, in a very strange way, that space between knowing and unknowing. And that's really kind of been the rhetoric that I've gone through lockdown with. So as you mentioned, I'm a jeweler and a designer and artist and a brand consultant, and I'm based in Edinburgh here. And usually my day job is as a founder of Maevona, which is an award-winning luxury brand in New York, and we create objects of beauty that people love. There's Scottish-themed engagement rings that people have purchased, telling the story of Scotland, and bringing that beauty and that romance and that heritage to people in America, particularly who have some connection to Scotland themselves. So I've always had that desire to bring meaning and to bring joy to people with the things that I do. And using jewelry particularly as a vehicle for doing that is quite a lovely thing when you have, precious objects that can kind of hold that meaning for people, rather than having to communicate. You can communicate so much more with objects than you can with words. So for me then with lockdown, when lockdown hit, I was really with my two daughters who are 7 and 3 and my husband. We had to move house, which is a long story, all family duties. And we really were in that place where we're creating, I realized very quickly, we're kind of creating family memories in this moment, and very lucky to be living at the bottom of a mountain where we could go 20 miles without having to stop at a road at our doorstep. But at the same time, that gratitude for nature and life and finding new ways of applying resourcefulness to the limits that were being created on us was a very good challenge for, essentially as a mum, life gets more messy, but as a person before having children, I certainly loved to know what was coming next at all times. And that sort of acceptance that you just can't know. And also trying to lead by example and balancing the work and duties of being a mum, so that your little people can look at you and think that you've got it all under control even when you haven't. And certainly then the main overriding theme for me in this lockdown was empathy. And really coming to understand, the one image that sticks with me when I was at the beginning of lockdown, watching on the news, people in the slums in India and the Philippines who are living in pipes and doing homeschooling in concrete pipes with a rag hanging over the end to help them isolate. And these are places that I've worked in, I've traveled in, I've lived in, several countries, and I've seen all this before, but I've never felt that sort of way to connect with it. And I think that made us realize as a world, we're all going through the same thing. And I think there was a great comfort and a way to learn from that, to see that we are all the same and nobody was excluded. And there was a real humanness to that. And certainly with everything else that was going on in the news, obviously, as also I'm an American, I was coming to understand what really privilege was. I never thought of myself as somebody that was being particularly privileged, but then I really realized that, I was living free from oppression and fear from free from fear of others. So I was privileged, and I had a lot to be thankful for, and coming to understand how many people were not living like that. And all these things, how could they feed into my work, and how could they feed into what I do, what comes next? So really, Tom, you can stop me whenever you want to, but the lockdown sort of marks these two halves in my life, that sort of before and after. I would say it sort of concludes with a sort of half-life birthday as well for me, and feeling like, it's time for me to really use my skills to do the best that I can, to be as brave and courageous as I can with my babies in tow, and also to find this balance, not to choose between work and home, which I think especially working mothers have always had to do this. You have to kind of drop everything, switch gears, and show up. And for me, I think I'm very interested in the space where I can create a business that involves them and lets me lead by example and show them how I feel they might want to view the world and how they might then choose to make it a better place. So I'm now working on 3 different businesses, and spreading my skills, I think, as crofters in Scotland are very well used to doing. And I think that makes us more adept at adapting, and going forward, looking at how I can use my skills to make even a for purpose and profit social enterprise that's going to use the best of my skills, with the small time that we have left as a human species, to do the best that we can for our community and our nation and our country and people around us. So that's really, where I'm coming at with where I am today, and my journey in the last few months. It's been a wild ride. You didn't even cut in. Thank you, Tom.
No, not at all. Well, the first thing you said was being in the space between knowing and unknowing. And one of my previous guests, Chip Conley, talks a lot about liminality. And that's the I forget the name of it right now. I've written about it. Anybody wants to look on my site. But there was an English philosopher who referred to it. And you sometimes you can communicate more with objects than words, as you said. Sometimes words can paint pictures. And he talks about liminal space as being fructile and fictitious, which I may have the definitions of these very old words wrong, but it feels like pregnant with possibility and a bit and ready to bear fruit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's quite amazing, because I know you've got 2 young daughters, and your husband's got a pretty consuming business that he's building up, and you've got to find that balance, and you've got to deal with childcare, which of course, so you can work in the business and time zones with New York, etc. But also, the period everybody had for a few months where, well, you weren't allowed to have any childcare in the house if you were privileged enough to afford it. So yeah, it's fascinating you've come out of this at this point, as we come to the end of 2020, with a sort of readiness to quite a big statement around sort of a half-life moment of like, okay, well, what's next is the second half of your life, which is kind of a big deal. I was talking to somebody today who just had a really good piece of family news around somebody who they thought had a really bad prognosis for something, and they came through it, and a really big, tight family, and this happened. And I said, I remember the day that the news and the media called the presidential election, which was the Saturday after the election, standing on the street going, okay, 2020, you got 54 days left. Bring it. Like, what? How can you make it up to us? And in the next week, we had 3 vaccine announcements. All right. Oh, and then Dominic Cummings resigned, and all kinds of good stuff. But I guess on the one hand, it's like, what comes next is 2021, and what do we do with that? And more immediately, just the next couple of weeks is what comes next. I hope for everybody is they're able to get some rest. And actually, I'm giving an opinion from talking to a lot of people, is I hope they're able to be forgiving and gentle with themselves around how they feel, because a lot of people are really struggling right now coming to the end of this year, and the uncertainty around 2021. So I'm just gathering a few thoughts. And so I'm really interested in both, there may be things you're in development in your space in between of your businesses. But But in terms of looking at the broader world, perhaps, what do you see comes next? What could you, in your wisdom, be talking to other people about for 2021 and beyond?
I think a lot of people are feeling that this is a calm before the storm, and I, really seeing how things are going to fall out next year and turn out. I think it's about really paying attention, listening, and seeing, finding new ways to see and new ways to notice just who we see in our daily lives, who we can help directly, because you just don't know what struggle people are going through when you see somebody. And I feel like my empathy is at the top tier. And I'm to the point where I'm actually looking how I could build my life around doing more to help others, not just on a daily basis, but as part of what I do. And I think that we all have a duty to do that, from the most competent and skilled or richest right down to people who have something more than nothing. And because there's a nakedness that COVID has brought to the world, which has really laid everything bare for people to see how others live and what others' challenges are. And I think is absolutely critical. And it's not just people, it's our planet. So I think that we have to find ways, with the very short time that we are in this planet, to do the best that we can do. And that's, like I said, on a daily basis, as well as looking forward. And it's different when you're at a business stage where you're starting out, or whether you're in a business that's very formed. It takes so much courage to change things that already exist, sometimes even more than building things that have never happened. But I think people really need to be brave, to keep that braveness that lockdown gave us going, and allow ourselves to find a new way of seeing what more we can do. Because I think there is so much more that can be done, and lockdown is full of those stories of hope, of how individuals or groups of individuals or groups of workers have changed the lives of so many with their actions. And I think, whatever your skill set, whatever your situation, whatever you have that is more than nothing, how can you share that more? And I mean, it's something that I love in general about Scottish people. They love to help their neighbours, and they're always looking out for the person next to them. And it's been a great thing, because it's given us mostly a lockdown experience where people have been so thoughtful and respectful of each other, putting each other first. And I think that's really a way that a society can be. And it's very difficult when you go anywhere in the world where there's, so much movement in the world. We all travel so much. I'm guilty of it too. And we find ourselves in different societies, and it happens from the smallest island to the biggest continents, where people are moving around all the time. And it brings this change, which allows you to see new places, but you're not necessarily invested in that local area where you can really understand the challenges to those people. So I think it's important for us to look at where we are and bloom where we're planted, and see others around us and figure out the best that we can do for them. For me as a maker and a designer, my job is to create really every day and kind of bring joy to others, that create a kind of, Gaelic culture has this concept of a carrying stream of goodwill and kindness and gestures, from the smallest to the biggest, whether you're making something or you're just saying something to somebody, or watching out for them, or a kind word, or holding a door. And in the grand scheme of things, I believe that history really decides the mark that we leave on the world. All we have to do is really kind of be the best that we can be to our fellow humans and ourselves in the time that we have. So it's a very interesting place to be, and of course full of opportunities if you are privileged enough to have the resources and the time and the luxuries to do something with that. But be very mindful of people who don't, and certainly, whatever restrictions I feel we have on our lives, I look at others who have so much more restriction and challenges and real suffering, and it doesn't make me want to just see them. I want to help them. So that's what I'm trying to put into words there, and turn into an actual mission statement.
So the key thing you talked about at the beginning, a theme coming out of lockdown was empathy. And so it's about, about seeing people, listening, seeing, and noticing. One of my previous guests on the show was Kay Scorer, who has been referred to as the Witch of Noticing. And she quite likes that title. Another mentor of mine who's not yet been on the show, but I'll get her at some point, Suki Smith, signs off every email with a line, awareness is the greatest agent for change. So it sounds like what you're embodying is an experience which, yes, we, for one moment in our lives, we could empathize with everybody around the uncertainty of COVID, because it was around the whole world at the same time. So it was a unique moment in human history. But how often do all of us, myself included, fail to see, fail to listen, fail to notice what's going on around us? And we're heading into a recession that will probably be the deepest in any of our lifetimes. And COVID has already profoundly increased inequality. So whether or not any of us choose to do something to address those less fortunate, to support those less fortunate than ourselves, that's an individual choice. But the more aware we can be of how people are getting on, there is this, to me, one of my least favorite words in the English language is fine. How are you? Fine. And there are many four-letter acronyms for that, none of which are pleasant. But the people will say that rather than, I don't want to bother with anybody about my problems. A tiny story was after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, we tried to get messages out which was a devastating hurricane, to all of the staff in one of the hotels we had, and say, could you all come to work like once, within a couple of days, we'll all meet, group together and see what we're going to do. And everybody said in words of one shape or other, they were fine. Yeah, I didn't believe them. I just didn't believe them. So I got anybody with a vehicle to go take people to where they were living and see if they were indeed fine. Mm-hmm. Put it this way, by nightfall, we had most of the staff staying in the hotel rooms because they were not fine. The places they were living were damaged, destroyed under tarpaulins. It was not pleasant. But people, didn't want to be a bother, as we'd say in Scotland. All right. So a bit of a downer, but it is a reality. Is if we can actually just listen, see, and notice people, really pay attention, in your words, then that creates space to do things differently.
That's all true, Tom, and I think the first step is to notice, and the second step is to figure out what you could do about it. And for me, it goes back to what we started with, is talking about, bringing beautiful things. It's not for me to decide whether what I make is beautiful, but if others think it is, then nothing could be a greater testament to me. And I feel, that's the greatest success for me, is to think that people would find joy in those things. And I think that can, I'm figuring out a way that can be rolled out. So it's not just things that I've made, but things that others have made that involve these things that bring us back to what gives us peace and satisfaction in terms of hand skills and handcrafted and human stories and elements that really bring our heritage to life in a way that, because when you look backwards, you can see further forwards and feel more peace in the moment that you're in. Certainly for me, that works. And I think, thinking about how we're just this one tiny, little mark on the horizon, and the time frame that we have, is what's the most that you can bring. And I think creative industries have so much, so many roles that that industry as a whole can play, because I think it's time. People have been spending so much time in nature. Certainly in Scotland, you see every place you go to, every beauty spot there's nowhere to park, because suddenly everybody's a hiker, and it's a great thing because kids are outside. You see kids walking with their parents and spending time together in lockdown. It was amazing on a weekday to see both parents holding the hands of kids and looking at each other and listening, and that was a beautiful thing and a beautiful memory that will always stay with me. And so that appreciation of nature, but we have to work so much harder to protect that. And if there's a way to bring those stories to people where they understand the value, then that sort of encapsulates everything for me, because it's a way of appreciating and storing, and also bringing value to how people can, it adds value to their lives in the moment as well as long term.
Yeah. So if we just go back to the thing one thing you talked about earlier and noticing was crofting communities. Mm-hmm. And for those who aren't familiar with this in the Highlands of Scotland, basically small holdings, and the joke around having 3 businesses just like a crofter. Because in those small villages, it was pretty much I know the Isle of Lewis, I don't really know anywhere else for this crofting, but very much hand to mouth. And of course, now there's the internet and stuff like this. Back when I used to spend almost all of my holidays there, there was one TV channel in black and white, right? And I'm not that old, but it does feel very divorced from the rest of the UK. It's very different, but everybody looks out for everybody else. And in those small villages, often 50, 100 houses. I was trying to talk to somebody online yesterday about how to start drinking whiskey and what to drink, and he said, "Is peaty a word?" I said, "Peaty is very much a word." So in my youth, I would be part of cutting, lifting, stacking, and bringing in peat, which had done over the course of several months, depending on, for me, the school holidays, because I never lived there. But whenever I taste a peaty whiskey, that's a piece of making, of artisanal work that brings me joy, because it takes me back. And in those communities, perhaps it's the entrepreneur in you. Maybe it's, you look at those island communities and go, because you design beautiful objects, right? Extraordinarily beautiful objects. And what can you do that makes them part of something that can potentially, be an heirloom piece that can live on, or be in a museum, or, but in that moment, they're part of something. And everybody can play a small part in that. And, one of my bucket list moments, right, in hindsight, we can see how important something was when a friend of mine in the west coast of Lewis, who was one of the first newly trained weavers in about 20 years, because the Harris Tweed industry nearly died. I'm saying this not for you, but for the listeners, because you know this. But my kids got to peddle his loom. And down one line of my family, it goes back many generations on the west coast of Lewis. And so it was just massive, literally goosebumps up and down my arms, just watching my boys peddle a loom and contribute to making a Harris Tweed. Absolutely priceless, and absolutely a lifetime, passing of heritage down to the generations. And these 3 boys who've visited Lewis many times, but are from the Cayman Islands, right? But they continue their great grandmother's heritage, So amazing. I don't know what, I'm sure you're going to come up with something amazing. And I guess maybe the bridge, we've not talked about this, but sometimes the beautiful objects you create are sold to the very rich, right? And then only they get to see them. So sometimes maybe the broader scope of who you can make a difference to is in there being part of the creation, but maybe part of it's also in them being able to see it. That it doesn't get stashed away in some multimillionaire's house. I don't know.
Well, it's a process, isn't it? I went through that with Maeve. After 2008 hit, we'd spent the first couple of years of launching the business with everybody. I would travel around America and people would say, well, nobody comes into my store asking for this, because the designs were so unique and kind of European and more sophisticated than these big satellite rings that people were buying at the time, covered in tiny diamonds. And then 2008 happened, and overnight, everybody went from wanting exact same bling that their friends had to wanting something pared down, less ostentatious, much more affordable, much more delicate. And overnight we became in demand. It was an amazing thing. So it just shows you how when you see something that you think would be a negative trajectory can actually be positive. And at that time, we decided we would make adjustments to make the products more accessible. And we completely changed the pricing structure so that everyday people that had expressed interest to want them but were unable to afford them, we made that possible. So I think there's a way, once you know exactly what you're trying to create, you can actually adjust it to bring it to the audience that really wants it in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So basically, it feels like you feel quite excited about 2021 and what comes next.
I do. Yes. I mean, I don't. I'm trying not to be too joyful when people are, I think, but I'm just so hyper conscious of those people that are struggling. I feel that it's an important time, and I feel like my purpose and my mission trajectory are setting, and for me, it feels that I can see where I can add value, and that makes me feel good as an artist.
And I would encourage you to, forget the being apologetic or reticent about it. I mean, you're a Scot, but you're also a New Yorker. You lived there for about half your life, right, in business. And, my guest last week, my friend Danny Coleman from the Cayman Islands, I was going to ask her lots of questions about leadership because she just led through an incredible crisis. All right. And she was at the absolute sort of fulcrum of that country's incredible performance, far beyond any larger country. But I gave up asking questions and just listened to her talk because she's just the most positive person in the whole world. And she did 103 days in a row without a day off in, stewarding the National Emergency Operations Center. So it makes me think, and I may have mentioned it in last week's show recently, but there's a monk called David Steindl Rast who did a TED talk. So, he says how to be happy. He just talks about we always get it in the wrong order, right? If we're grateful, then we'll be happy, rather than being grateful for being happy.
Yep.
And so it can be a choice. And he says, how is it often the people with the least are the happiest? And in fact, going back when I first encountered Chip Conley many, many years ago, he took Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and applied it to business in a book called Peak. And the story he starts with is seeing in a hotel a minimum wage housekeeper, working really, really hard and just with a big smile on her face, singing to herself. And he'd been worrying about his business and all the millions of dollars he had borrowed and whether or not he could go through a recession and whether he could make it. And he went, what are you worrying about? It's like, she has far less than me and she's happy,
Yeah.
So how do we actually, look at it from that standpoint? So I'm very pleased to have had 2 weeks in a row guests that are will have their own challenges in life, but are also just irrepressibly positive and bring that into the world. I'm not having a 29th of December show because I'm going to take a break. But my guest next week spent 35 years as a pastor in a church in the Midwest of the US.
Wow.
And I'm not religious, and it's not a show that focuses on religion, but may get some spiritual thoughts from Pastor Jeff Raker next week, I think. And also a person who's also very grounded and also irrepressibly positive. So I guess there's something about that. And I guess, I will now leave you the last couple of minutes, as is now my tradition, to let my guests just have some thoughts and wrap up.
Well, I just think just the other day, my 7-year-old who loves jokes told me a really funny joke. So I thought I would share it with you because it wasn't as funny at the moment. It was at the time, it made me think differently, in the way that our kids suddenly start being our teachers. So she says, well, I'll do it to you. But so, Tom, will you remember me in an hour?
Yeah.
Will you remember me in a week?
Yes.
Will you remember me in a month?
Uh-huh.
Will you remember me in a year?
Yep.
A decade?
Yep.
A century?
I'll be dead.
Knock, knock.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
You forgot me already. It's so funny because I laughed and then I thought, it hurts. It hurts to be forgotten. It hurts to be not seen. And I wanted to just put that because I have this empathy dial that's turned up so high right now that I suddenly thought it does not feel nice to be forgotten and to be overlooked. And, I think, the more that we can focus on what's around us and find ways to express gratitude and for what we have and share what we have with others, whatever our skill sets and loves and happiness creators are, then I think the better the world will be and the well-being society will blossom.
Fantastic. Thank you for I see you, and thank you for seeing others. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Tom.